And I think, on that note, I'd like to pass it to Alok because I have a feeling he has something similar to say about the Indian situation, despite it not characterizing itself as an illiberal constitution.
Thanks, Surya, and thank you all for inviting me to speak at this particular webinar. It's my pleasure. And when Surya first invited me to speak, I said, "Oh, so you'll be giving me about 3 or 4 hours to talk about India." And he said, "No, you have 15, so wrap it up quickly." I'll try my best to make sense of what has been going on in India in about 15 minutes. So, without going into too many specific incidents and events, I'll try to talk about two broad themes, and that is why I've titled my talk as Lawless Lawmaking and a Supine Supreme Court. We have a situation where, and it's a great point to take off from what Gabor is just speaking about, that even though Hungary tried to introduce laws, in India, everything is being done by presidential or bureaucratic decree. And that has had consequences of its own. The other aspect that I want to, time willing, to speak a little bit is that we have a Supreme Court which has pretty much given up its role as a constitutional body. That for us as legal scholars, we are talking about what the Supreme Court is doing and not what the Supreme Court is saying. This puts us in a very tricky position. We are used to reading judgments, we are used to critiquing judgments, we are used to critiquing opinions of the court, but we don't know, and we're still trying to make sense of a court which refuses to hear cases, which adjourns cases till they become meaningless. And what is driving that impulse is something that I want to be talking about a little bit today. So let me without any ado, get into my presentation. I will very quickly share my screen. Yes, okay. And going into the, all right. So briefly, okay. So what are the broader theme of my talk is that what was happening in India for the last decade or so has gotten accelerated because of COVID-19. And there are three themes which I think are relevant when we talk about India. One is that lawmaking has become less participative and more executive, with very little space for debate and discourse. The second is that institutions have sort of withered on the vine. They are no longer capable of doing that jobs as was understood under the constitution and under law, and they're unable to do their constitutional duties. The third, and which is something that I won't have time to discuss, but it's nonetheless important to flag here, there's an aggressive majoritarian push to redefine the mainstream and push communities into the margins. And this is generally what is called the Hindu, relating to the religion, Hindi as in relating to the language, and Hindustan as being a place for Hindus who are Hindi speakers. So this is something that, this will come up again and again as I speak, but I don't want to focus too much on this for the moment because I think that's part of it will be an entirely different discussion. But I want to talk about the first two specifically. Okay, as I've said, this is what I'll be talking about. But very briefly, to start with a little bit of the constitutional and political context prior to COVID-19. We are currently in the second term of the National Democratic Alliance, which is being headed by Narendra Modi. The first term in 2014 saw three major interventions that I think have continued to have an impact in the way in which constitutional and legal developments in India are taking place. The first is demonetization, which was the withdrawal of about 85 to 90% of India's currency overnight, without any warning, with like 4 hours of notice. The government said all 500 rupees and 1000 rupees notes are no longer valid. Now, this was an example where we saw of a kind of rule of law breakdown, where over the 50 days the government took to try and sort out the situation, there were 74 executive orders issued. Now, this is an absurd number. First of all, demonetization was not done through law. Keep these things in mind when we talk about COVID. It wasn't done through a legislation. They found some provision in some law which enabled something to this effect, but the exercise itself was completely chaotic, where everything was done through executive orders, which used to change in the matter of hours. They used to change in the course of a day. And if you look at the numbers, 74 and 50, sometimes there were more than one order being issued in a day, which caused complete chaos. And each of them dealt with so many different topics that by the end of it, nobody knew what was going on. There was an excessive centralization. And when I say centralization, I mean it at two levels. If you think of India a little bit like the European Union, think of it as a much more powerful European Union with the central government as the EU itself, where the central government withdrew a lot of powers for itself from the state. but also at the central government level, all decision making was no longer collaborative between various departments, but completely centralized within the Prime Minister's office. So you have two levels of centralization which took place. The third is interference in judicial appointments in the Supreme Court. Now, in India, we have a situation where the judges pretty much appoint themselves, and that has meant that even though on paper the executive does not have a big say, it is in fact a very opaque, non-transparent system where nobody really knows why someone has become a judge. This has in fact made it easier for the government to say, we don't like this person, we don't like that person, we don't want them to be a judge, or we don't want this person to be a judge at this point of time. So we have seen a much greater interference in judicial appointments. The second term, which started in 2019, has only accelerated some of these things. Kashmir's special status, India's only Muslim majority state, lost its special status. Kashmir was one of 10 states which had some kind of a special status. Kashmir lost its special status. The Babri Masjid dispute was decided in favor, it was a broadly communal dispute between Hindus and Muslims. It was decided in favor of Hindus by a judgment which cannot really be described as a judgment, more of like a settlement, like between two unequal parties. It's a settlement overseen by a judiciary. You've had these letters that you see here. You have a process by there's an introduction of a new legislation which threatens to redefine the idea of citizenship in India itself by imposing a religious test. Citizenship in India is not a constitutional definition. It's defined by law, and this law wanted to redefine citizenship to exclude Muslims from certain countries from even applying for citizenship, or rather applying on a certain procedure for citizenship. It led to massive response, and which was unfortunate, which was cut short because of the response to COVID. And as a result of civil society protests against the CAA, which is the Citizenship Amendment Act, you had riots, communal riots between Hindus and Muslims break out in the city of Delhi for the first time in more than 30 years. And very clearly, the government took the side of the Hindus in the riots, basically trying to pin the blame on Muslims and so on. But this was the context in which COVID entered into India. You had a Hindustan imposing majoritarian government. There is a disregard for constitutional norms and processes. There is an extreme centralization of power, where bureaucrats decide and members of parliament implement. I think Gabor put it well that, instead of a parliament having a government, it is a government which has a parliament. And you have weakened constitutional institutions, especially the Supreme Court of India. Comes COVID hits India, the first few responses to completely ignore it and hope it goes away. The response happened sometime late in March, which is about 1 month too late for India, as a result of which we have, I think, the 6th or 7th most cases in the world. Deaths are fairly low because of the population profile being largely young. But it's been a complete messed up situation. I'll try and explain it a little bit more. Under our constitution, public health is the responsibility of states, whereas it's the duty of the center to look at the spread of epidemic diseases. Unfortunately, none of our laws actually allow for tackling a nationwide epidemic. In India, because of the size, any epidemic nationwide is pretty much a pandemic. But unfortunately, we don't have a legal framework which will allow us to do this. But instead of addressing this and going back to our example from demonetization, the government found a provision in a law which might potentially help them and decided to run with it. In India, there is a word called jugaad, which is like making do. There's no equivalent in any other language. It's called making do. And this was an act of legal jugaad. You just pick something which sounds approximately right and run with it, even if it is not the best tool. So you use the National Disaster Management Act, which was actually enacted to fight natural disasters like earthquakes, landslides, floods, tsunamis, and so on, to deal with a nationwide pandemic. A provision of this law effectively was taken to try and run every single part of India from the central government, as opposed to leaving it to the state governments to manage the situation. Although on paper there is supposed to be a National Disaster Management Authority overseeing this, and there's a National Executive Committee overseeing this, in reality the entire exercise was run out of the Prime Minister's office and the Ministry of Home Affairs. A very influential minister of the present government runs the Ministry of Home Affairs, and that has taken over the decision making. What has been the impact of this? You had, again, as I mentioned with the demonetization, you had 94 orders, guidelines, addenda, letters in 68 days. This is legal chaos. This leads to the kinds of rights violations that you can't even imagine. One of the biggest tragedies has been that this has created such chaos and confusion that migrant workers have tried to walk hundreds of kilometers back home. Imagine someone trying to walk from Paris to Hungary, right? Because there is no means for them to get back home, and the cities where they're living in have made no provisions to provide for migrant workers who are suddenly without jobs, without food, without shelter, because an overnight lockdown was imposed by the government. There has been no systematic consultative process. It's ad hoc discussions with chief ministers of states without really discussing with fellow cabinet colleagues. No involvement of elected representatives, even at the ground level. Like I'm sure down to the level of corporator councillor, who are local level representatives, there has been almost no involvement of them. And you've had a top-down decision making, which has meant that everything is decided in Delhi and left to the states to try and implement. These are the consequences of this. Has been one of the largest scale human rights violations in this country's history. And this is, it's not, you've had instances where parts of the country have been under lockdown. You've had instances where parts of the country have experienced human rights violations. You've never had a situation where the country as a whole has had to undergo through this trauma. I mentioned that COVID is not fully under control. I have mentioned that migrant workers, and this is the most heartbreaking thing that you will see. Imagine we have had an internal refugee crisis. That's the only way to describe this. It is something that the government is unable to handle. The government did not foresee, and the government has no clear idea how to respond. On the other hand, you've had two other unnecessarily bad outcomes. What is essentially a public health emergency has been treated as a law and order problem. One of the points that Donna sort of made was that you can't use a public health to try and make further rights violations. Unfortunately, that is exactly what has happened in India. The government has used it has treated this public health emergency as like essentially a law and order problem, where the policeman on the street with the baton is the first and last mode of implementation of this particular mechanism. We've also had a communalization of the discourse where Muslims are being blamed for quote unquote the spread of COVID. This has meant that there's a lack of trust in the government, and responses are also being tailored on the angle of religion. I don't have too much time to go to the Supreme Court, but let me try and quickly, briefly summarize what has happened. And if maybe there are questions, I can go into this in some detail. Even when rights violations have been brought to the court's notice, the court has adopted a don't ask, don't tell approach, which is that don't bring it to us, we won't even look at it. They have not looked at any issues of migrant workers about relaxing something. This is a huge So India has Supreme Court at the national level and high courts at the state level. High courts have been very active in trying to address some of the rights violations that have taken place in the respective states. But shockingly, the Supreme Court seems to have imagined that it can completely ignore what is happening in the country and move on as if nothing has happened. It's barely functioning in the first place, thanks to COVID. But we have a situation where the Supreme Court does not hear cases at all. We have a Supreme Court in India which first response is to try and dismiss a concern out of hand. Second response is to try and adjourn it and hope it goes away. And when really push comes to shove, maybe write a judgment which actually does something. This is a feature which has been sort of commented upon by a lot of people. I'll try and share some results at the end of this discussion. But we are in India, we're living through an emergency situation that is not quote unquote an emergency. Our constitution actually provides for 3 different kinds of emergency. And as Gabor ended the end part of his speech to invoke Carl Schmitt, we are in an emergency situation which was not envisaged in the constitution. It is still a little bit bound in the sense that powers are being drawn from a law, but those powers are being extended and used in a manner which is way beyond the law. To come to a point that Donna made right at the beginning, which is about how even any derogation of rights have to be in the framework of a law. What we have is pure executive abrogation of rights. It is not in any manner through a law passed by Parliament, and it has ensured a large-scale deprivation of rights. This has also meant that remedies available against this breach have been very limited, and it is because of the fault of these institutions. They have been unable to respond, or rather don't want to respond. And again, that's a completely long discussion. When they've responded, and that's the point, whenever somebody close to the government has been affected, you can see Arnab Goswami there, he's someone who's considered close to the government. When he's been affected, the courts have rushed in to defend. But if someone who's been opposed to the government, like Gautam Navlaka, they have been very hands-off and said, too bad, you have to go to jail. So this is the something which tells us that there is something fundamentally wrong with the way our institutions respond in situation. If I have to summarize it, it is a large-scale breakdown of rule of law and the constitutional order in India has been pushed to the brink, and this is without counting the two cyclones and the locusts which we're already suffering with. So bringing that on that very happy note, I will end this discussion and I will wait for your response. Okay.
Thanks very much, Alok. It's always refreshing to hear what the current government is up to in India these days.